April 13. 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The morning heat shimmered off the steel fuselages of Mitsubishi Zeros lined along the coral strip. Mechanics in grease-stained uniforms wiped their brows, cursing the Pacific Sunday. A young Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Kenji Okada, leaned against the nose of his aircraft, cigarette dangling from his lips, laughing with his comrades. They were mocking an American twin-boom fighter they'd seen in reconnaissance photos, an ungainly machine the Allies called the P-38 Lightning. "It looks like a flying fork," Okada joked, tracing its twin tails in the air. "Too big, too slow, an easy kill." His comrades chuckled, confident. The Zeros of the Imperial Navy still ruled the skies over the Solomons. In the officer's tent nearby, however, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was finalizing plans for an inspection tour. He wanted to visit frontline bases to raise morale after months of bitter defeats. His itinerary times, routes, coordinates, was being typed by an aide. Yamamoto's attention to detail was legendary. Every minute of his schedule was precise. But that precision would prove fatal. Because somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a cramped intelligence hut on Guadalcanal, American cryptographers were already listening. April 14th, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, Navy Radio Intercept Station. The room was dim and stifling. A low hum of equipment mixed with the faint clicks and buzzes of decoded Morse. Ensign Thomas "Tommy" Reeves, his uniform soaked through with sweat, hunched over a desk cluttered with code sheets and dull pencils. He adjusted his headphones and leaned closer. "Yamamoto. Buin. Etten April. 900 for departure." He froze. The hairs on his neck stood up. Then he reached for the red phone. Just days earlier, the Japanese Navy's communication cipher, JN-25, had given up its latest secret thanks to the painstaking work of Station Hypo and other Allied cryptanalysis units scattered across the Pacific. American codebreakers had been following traffic regarding a high-priority inspection tour. But this was no ordinary passenger. This was Yamamoto, the man who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, the face of Japan's naval war machine, the living architect of humiliation for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And now, they had him. The message laid it all out with the kind of military precision that turned intelligence officers into predators. Admiral Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0945 hours on April 18th in two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Destination: the island of Bougainville, ETA 1035. Within hours, the message had traveled encrypted, double verified through the chain of command, finally arriving in the office of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. His response was succinct. It carried the weight of revenge. Tally-ho. The green light was given. The United States was going to assassinate the highest-ranking officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. But assassination wasn't a word they used. Operation Vengeance, as it would later be called, wasn't just a reprisal for Pearl Harbor. It was strategic decapitation. Yamamoto wasn't just a symbol, he was irreplaceable. Unlike many of Japan's military leadership, he had studied in the United States. He knew the industrial might of his enemy and had warned against a protracted war. Losing him could send a psychological shockwave through the empire. There was only one problem: how to reach him. The flight plan showed the target flying low over open ocean, deep within Japanese-controlled airspace. Bougainville was 400 miles from the nearest Allied base on Guadalcanal, no standard U.S. The fighter could make the round trip, except one: the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. Twin engines, twin tails, long range, heavy firepower. To some American pilots, the Lightning was awkward and bulky, not built for dogfights. But it was the only fighter in the Allied arsenal with the legs to reach Bougainville, intercept Yamamoto, and return. On April 16th, Major John W. Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, was summoned to a classified briefing. Inside, he found a map pinned to the wall, and a senior officer waiting. "Major," the officer said, "you're going to take out Yamamoto." Mitchell blinked. "Sir, you'll be flying 18 P-38 seconds in tight formation. No deviation, no radios, no one knows but us. They would fly at wave-top level no higher than 50 feet to avoid radar. 8 fighters would cover the intercept group, while 4 would break off to target the lead bomber. Another 4 would hit the second. It was a suicide mission in everything but name. 1 leak, 1 delay, 1 zero spotting them early, and they'd never come back." Back in the barracks, pilots began quietly writing letters they didn't intend to mail. Among them was Captain Thomas G. Landfire, a brash pilot from Idaho with a reputation for confidence and kills. He sharpened his focus as he cleaned his twin, 50 caliber Brownings. "They won't see us coming," he muttered. "And I'll put a few more notches on the nose." Beside him, Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, a quieter, more methodical flyer, checked and rechecked his fuel lines. He would be flying the point position in one of the killer elements. Neither of them nor anyone in the squadron was officially told who they were hunting. But rumors spread. The flight plan was too specific. The secrecy too intense. "Yamamoto," someone whispered. No one denied it. By April 17th, the plan was locked in. Aircraft were checked, guns loaded, the route studied with a navigator's eye and a gambler's nerve. 18 aircraft. 400 miles out. 400 miles back. It target. No room for error. The sun dipped below the horizon over Guadalcanal that night in an eerie quiet. Rain fell lightly on the metal skins of the waiting lightnings. The men slept restlessly beneath mosquito nets, haunted not by fear but by the weight of their mission. If they succeeded, it would be one of the most precise aerial assassinations in history. If they failed, Yamamoto would live to inspire Japan's war effort for another year, and they'd vanish into the ocean. April 18th, 1943, 07:000 hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Dawn clawed over the jungle ridge like a dull knife. The skies were low and heavy with haze, thick with the scent of dew, fuel, and salt. The 18 P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron stood ready, twin tails rising like forked vipers in the humid air. Ground crews moved fast, checking flaps, fuel tanks, oxygen lines. Major John Mitchell strode across the tarmac, clipboard in hand, jaw tight. He didn't smoke. Didn't need to. The adrenaline did its own work. "We fly radio silent. We fly low. We don't turn back." No one answered. They knew the stakes. Captain Thomas Landfear climbed into his P-38 tail number, Put-Put Maru, and adjusted his flight goggles. His hands moved automatically. Magnetos, throttle check, mixture, flaps. He muttered a quick prayer, more habit than faith. A mechanic tapped the cowling and gave a thumbs up. The twin Allison engines roared to life, sending a blast of hot air down the runway. Landfire looked left to Lieutenant Rex Barber, already taxiing into formation. The 2 men had been chosen to spearhead the interception flight, the Killer Group. 4 P-38 seconds, tasked with engaging the lead G-4M Betty, the one carrying Yamamoto. At 0710, Mitchell's voice crackled once over the squadron's private channel. "Tight formation. Let's bring hell." Then, silence. The Lightnings took off one by one, rising into the overcast sky, leveling off at 50 feet above the water, skimming the waves like silver ghosts. The flight path had been carefully calculated, not a straight line, but a sweeping arc south and then northwest, designed to intercept the enemy flight over Bougainville at precisely 0935 hours. The planes were armed to the teeth. 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, plus a 20mm Hispano cannon. Each carried extra drop tanks to squeeze every possible mile from their fuel load, but every gallon mattered. At this altitude, even small variances in drag or throttle could mean running dry before they made it home. The men knew it. They kept eyes locked forward, scanning the sea. The radio stayed off. Only gestures and practiced instinct kept the formation tight as they rode the treacherous air. Behind them, Guadalcanal faded into the haze. 0845 hours. Over the southern tip of Bougainville, the sun broke through. The lightnings climbed to 10,000 feet in a steep, silent curve. This was the final vector. 100 miles per hour wind buffeted their wings, but the formation held. In Mitchell's cockpit, his altimeter ticked up. His mind raced through time-distance equations. Right on schedule. Then, on the horizon, a glint. A dark speck against the blue. 2. No 3. 9 aircraft. Betties and zeros. There they are, whispered Barber, flicking his arming switch. The intercept group of 4 P-38 seconds. Barber, Lanfear, First Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine peeled off into a shallow dive, gaining speed. The rest of the squadron climbed to cover. Barber took the lead, pulling ahead in a sweeping leftward arc. Lanfear banked hard right. They would cross the Betties from both flanks. 0910 hours. Northeast Bougainville. 6,000 feet. Admiral Yamamoto, dressed immaculately in his naval uniform, sat in the second seat of the lead G4M Betty, writing in a small, leather-bound notebook. He was tired. At 59, the travel was wearing him down. He glanced out the port-side window, seeing the vast ocean below. In the cockpit, the Betty's pilot, Lieutenant Hayashi, flew steady, surrounded by 2 other bombers and 6 Zero escorts. The formation had just begun descent into the airfield at Balalay. Yamamoto would be greeted with full ceremony, the banners already hung, but he would never land. Out of the clouds came Barber's P-38, engines screaming, nose down, guns primed. The Zeros barely had time to react. Their formation, flying high into the rear of the Betties, was out of position. Barber opened fire. 4. 50 cals and a 20mm cannon unleashed hell into the lead Betty. Tracers ripped across the sky, stitching the fuselage and tearing into the starboard wing. The bomber veered. A puff of black smoke burst from the left engine. Inside, Yamamoto's head snapped toward the impact. His aide barely had time to shout. Simultaneously, Landfire engaged a second Betty, firing in a high-speed pass from the opposite side. He claimed to have scored fatal hits, but visibility was poor, and later controversy would rage over who landed the final blow. Barber stayed on target. He closed the gap, just 100 yards from the wounded Betty. The left engine caught flame. The bomber began to spiral. "Come on. Go down." Barber's last burst shattered the tail section. The Betty flipped onto its back and plunged into the jungle canopy of Bougainville. No parachutes. No survivors. Below, villagers reported a large black column rising through the trees. For hours, the forest burned. And there, among the wreckage, rescue teams would later find a body still strapped into the seat, his hand clenched tightly around a tattered notebook. The man who had once stood on the deck as Japan struck Pearl Harbor was now dead in a jungle grave, and the sky, once ruled by Zero pilots laughing at the lightning, now echoed with silence. April 18th, 1943, 0938 hours. Over Bougainville, the moment the lead Betty bomber exploded into flame, the sky fractured into a chaotic dogfight. The element of surprise had lasted mere seconds, just long enough for the Americans to strike hard and fast. Captain Thomas Landfire, having completed his high-speed pass, looped upward in a tight climbing turn, searching for threats. He spotted a pair of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters banking hard toward him, their engines snarling. He gritted his teeth and pulled the nose of his P-38 into a sharp turn. The dogfight was on. Behind him, Lieutenant Rex Barber had turned sharply left, seeking altitude after confirming the lead Betty's destruction. He caught a glimpse of the second bomber, attempting to escape westward, engines chugging, black smoke billowing. "Too far," he muttered, pushing the throttle forward anyway. The air was filled with fire and thunder. Tracers crisscrossed like threads of burning silk. The Zero escorts, finally reacting, engaged the covering P-38 seconds. One Lightning Lieutenant Raymond Hines began trailing smoke. His port engine was hit, leaking coolant. He turned toward open water, hoping to limp back to base. He never made it. Mitchell, flying high cover, saw a Heinz plane descend in a slow arc and vanish into the jungle canopy, no radio, no parachute. He marked the location silently on his map. Meanwhile, on the ground below, in the dense rainforests of Bougainville, just a few kilometers from the coastal village of Aku, a group of native Melanesian villagers looked to the sky in horror. A flaming wreck had come crashing down through the jungle canopy, snapping trees like twigs and carving a deep scar into the underbrush. They approached the smoldering debris cautiously. Scattered among the wreckage were twisted pieces of fuselage, green and silver, with a red circle on the side, the distinctive roundel of the Japanese Navy. Among the debris, they found 2 charred bodies, still strapped into twisted metal frames. One wore the remains of a crisp white uniform. On his left chest, a scorched rank insignia. When Japanese troops arrived later that day, they cordoned off the area and removed the bodies. It was quiet. No ceremony, no announcement. But word spread quickly Yamamoto was dead. Back in the sky, 0950 hours. The remaining P-38 seconds disengaged in pairs. Fuel was critical. The round-trip journey had always been risky, and now, with some planes damaged and altitude lost during combat, the return would push every engine to its limit. Barber leveled off over the sea, scanning his fuel gauges. Almost empty. He jettisoned his auxiliary drop tanks, watching them tumble end over end into the ocean below. No more fighting, he said to himself. Just get home. Mitchell's formation reassembled in 2s and 3s, scattered but intact. Except for Hein. 1 man gone, 1 aircraft destroyed. But the mission impossible in planning was a success. Hours later, Guadalcanal. 1,400 hours. The P-38 seconds came roaring back over the ridge of jungle and coastal hills like migrating birds returning to roost. One by one they landed, tires screeching against the sun-baked strip. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, noting bullet holes, oil leaks, cracked panels. Barber climbed down, knees stiff, back soaked in sweat. He didn't speak until he saw Mitchell. "We got him," he said simply. Lanfear landed shortly after. Before his wheels had stopped spinning, he was already claiming the kill. He insisted he'd shot down the lead Betty, that it had been his burst that hit Yamamoto. Barber said nothing. In the debriefing that followed, both men reported engaging the lead aircraft. Both claimed hits. The confusion of the moment made it nearly impossible to say whose fire had struck first or fatally. The Army Air Forces eventually credited both Lanfear and Barber with a shared kill, but the debate would rage for decades. Meanwhile, at Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, no radio message came from Bougainville, no arrival confirmation. Hours passed. Finally, a reconnaissance aircraft was dispatched to retrace the flight path. That evening, search parties confirmed the worst. Admiral Yamamoto was dead. His body had been recovered, still in uniform, his katana nearby, notebook clutched in his hand. The jungle had not consumed him. It had entombed him. But the Japanese High Command refused to announce it immediately. For nearly 4 weeks, they kept his death secret even from many within the Imperial Navy. May 21st, 1943, Tokyo. A funeral was held in secret. No reporters, no radio broadcast, just dignitaries, military officials, and a black and white photograph placed on an empty chair. Only then did the Japanese people learn the truth. The admiral who struck Pearl Harbor had been struck down in return. The empire was stunned. For the first time, the war had taken something it could not replace. Yamamoto was more than a strategist. He was a symbol, a samurai. And now, he was gone. Late May 1943, Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters. The room was silent, eerily so. Black banners of mourning draped the walls, and portraits of Admiral Yamamoto stood framed in solemn corners. The air hung heavy with incense, formal speech, and the crushing weight of absence. A naval officer stepped to the podium and cleared his throat. His words were rehearsed, but his voice trembled. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, fell in battle while inspecting frontline forces in the Solomon Islands. His sacrifice shall inspire generations. They did not say how he died. They did not mention the P-38 seconds. They did not speak of interception, ambush, or failure. To the Japanese people, Yamamoto had been lost to the tides of war, a martyr among the clouds. But within the corridors of power, the truth struck like a blade to the chest. The news hit the officer corps with a chill deeper than any bomb or bullet. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, already beleaguered by supply shortages and the mounting failure of campaigns in New Guinea and Guadalcanal, was furious not merely because Yamamoto had died, but because it had been preventable. How could his itinerary be broadcast? How could they know exactly where to find him? He demanded in a closed-door meeting. The answer, though few dared say it, was simple. Japan's code had been broken, and if the Americans had intercepted this, what else had they heard? In the inner circles of the Imperial Navy, the loss was personal. Yamamoto had been the soul of their fleet. A man who had trained in America, played poker with Navy officers in Washington, and warned the High Command not to provoke a war they could not win. He had commanded respect, not just through rank, but through clarity of vision and strategic genius. Even his enemies admired him. At Pearl Harbor, he had carefully calculated the strike, reluctantly. He knew what he was unleashing. After the attack, he reportedly told aides, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Now that giant had struck back with chilling precision. In the Pacific, among the Japanese fleet, morale cratered. Whispers spread through ships and island garrisons. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but something had changed. Sailors stopped joking about American aircraft. Pilots no longer laughed at the P-38. Instead, they asked, "What else can it do?" The Zero pilots, once kings of the air, had begun dying in droves. American planes were faster, more durable, and seemingly everywhere at once. New tactics, radar, and coordinated fighter-bomber strikes were overwhelming even elite units. The skies once ruled by the rising sun had turned hostile, and Yamamoto, the one man who might have adjusted strategy to counter this shift, was gone. Meanwhile, in Washington, news of the successful intercept arrived quickly, but the mood was more somber than celebratory. Inside a secure room at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs received the decrypted Japanese telegram confirming Yamamoto's death. General George C. Marshall read it twice, then passed it quietly to Admiral Ernest King. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was notified immediately. He said only 4 words, "Gentlemen, this will do." There was no press release, no fanfare. The operation had to remain secret. If the Japanese knew their codes were compromised, they'd change them. The Allies wanted JN-25 to keep bleeding secrets. So the official line became, Yamamoto was shot down during routine patrol. The men of the 339th Fighter Squadron were ordered to remain silent. No press, no bragging, no medals, at least not publicly. It was a bitter pill for pilots like Rex Barber, who returned home to obscurity for a mission that changed the course of the war. In private, though, the planners celebrated. Operation Vengeance had decapitated Japan's naval command at a critical moment. As 1943 wore on, the tide began to shift visibly. The Allies went on the offensive across the Pacific. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands were taken. The Solomons campaign began to isolate Rabaul. And in the Marianas, preparations were underway to bring the war closer to Japan's doorstep. Without Yamamoto's cautious hand, the Japanese Navy became more fractured. His successors lacked his political capital and deep understanding of America's industrial tempo. They began rushing counterattacks, costly, disorganized, and ultimately suicidal. Yamamoto had feared this. Back in the Solomons, the jungle slowly reclaimed the wreckage. The site where Yamamoto died became a shrine, then a ruin. Wreckage was scavenged, bones removed. The scar in the trees eventually filled with green. Years later, American veterans would return not as conquerors, but as tourists and historians. They'd stand over the crater where the Betty fell, now covered in ferns and silence. Some brought their sons, some brought medals, all brought memories. And for those who had flown that mission, the moment never faded, the tension of low-level flight, the thunder of the intercept, the fireball, the silence after. Yamamoto's death had been a single blow, but its echoes still lingered in every jungle trail, every dogfight that followed, and every command decision shaped by his absence. The man who had planned the beginning of the war never lived to see its end. Summer 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The red dust of the airstrip still clung to the landing gear of the P-38 seconds, even weeks after the Yamamoto mission. The tropical rains came daily, but the ground never stayed clean. It was the same with the war. No matter how many victories the Allies won, the stains of combat lingered. Inside a canvas tent lined with folding chairs and crates of .50 caliber ammunition, the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron gathered for another briefing. The Yamamoto mission wasn't mentioned, not directly, but everyone in the room felt its weight. Captain Rex Barber sat in the back, arms folded, jaw clenched. He hadn't been allowed to talk to the press. No photos, no credit, just silence. He'd flown the most dangerous mission of his life and returned to find the world moving on. Thomas Landfire, on the other hand, was talking. To everyone. "I came in above and behind," he explained for the 5th time, gesturing with his hands. "Got him in a clean burst. Saw the tail shear off before I pulled out." Barber didn't respond. But inside, something boiled. He knew what he'd seen. He knew who'd been behind that Betty until the end. The kill didn't matter for glory. It mattered for history. But the Army Air Forces had made its choice. Shared credit. Clean. Political. Equal. Still, the men who'd flown the mission, Mitchell, Barber, Holmes, knew the truth in their bones. And so did the enemy. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters scrambled to control the narrative. The official story was polished. Admiral Yamamoto had died in aerial combat. An honorable end. A warrior's death. The state-sponsored press avoided any suggestion of an ambush or intelligence failure. The truth remained classified at the highest levels. But rumors leaked, as they always do. And soon, whispers of an assassination mission began to circulate among the officers of the Navy and the Army. They had heard of the strange, fork-tailed planes, how they had flown low, undetected, like phantoms, how they had struck with surgical precision. For the first time, Japan's officer corps began to openly fear American capabilities. Not just firepower, but planning. Reach, intelligence. Yamamoto had been careful, paranoid even, yet somehow they had gotten him. The P-38 Lightning, once mocked by both sides, now became a legend. Its silhouette, 2 booms. One cockpit was burned into the minds of every Japanese aviator in the South Pacific. Pilots who once joked about its bulk now scanned the horizon nervously for the glint of its silver wings. Yamamoto's Reaper, some whispered. American morale soared. Back in the States, when the mission was finally declassified, newspapers ran the headline, "Yamamoto killed in air ambush." Hollywood took note. Comic books drew P-38 seconds breathing fire through jungle skies. Propaganda posters showed lightning streaking across the Pacific like divine vengeance. Lockheed's factory in Burbank ramped up production. Thousands more P-38 seconds rolled off the line. Some were named Miss Vengeance, others Betty Buster. Every pilot wanted to fly the plane that brought down the architect of Pearl Harbor. But the real transformation wasn't symbolic. It was tactical. After the Yamamoto intercept, American commanders saw what was possible when intelligence, planning, and precision aircraft worked in harmony. It wasn't just about brute force anymore, it was about surgical strikes. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, similar missions began to materialize. Low-level raids on Japanese headquarters, targeted bombing runs on radio stations and airfields, interception of transport aircraft carrying high-ranking officers. The P-38 became the tip of the spear, fast, long-legged, and deadly. It flew over Burma, over the Philippines, deep into China. It escorted bombers over Italy and hunted V-1 launch sites in France. Even in Europe, Luftwaffe pilots came to respect and fear the Lightning. In the Solomons, the war marched on. The Yamamoto mission had been a moment, a flash of precision in a war of attrition. But it didn't stop the bloodshed. Bougainville would be fought over for months. The jungles consumed men on both sides. But for every American soldier or sailor trudging through mud or manning a gun turret in the Pacific, the death of Yamamoto was proof. We're turning the tide. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. Not all at once, but fracture by fracture. Pearl Harbor had been their surprise. Now the U.S. had delivered its own. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, surviving Japanese officers would speak of Yamamoto's death not just as a loss of a commander, but as the loss of a compass, asterisk. He had advocated for expansion, but also for limits, for diplomacy, for discipline. In his absence, the Imperial Navy grew bolder, yet more reckless. Midway had already cost them dearly. But now, without Yamamoto, there was no restraining voice. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Shogo operations, the kamikaze wave, all would follow, and none would end well. Rex Barber would fly more missions before rotating home. He never sought attention, never issued rebuttals, never tried to change the official record. But years later, when historians reviewed gun camera footage and flight paths, many concluded he had been the one. The final burst, the fatal strike, the man who brought Yamamoto down. When asked in a quiet interview decades later how he felt, Barber only said, "We were sent to do a job. We did it, and we came home." But not all of them did. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, the quiet pilot from the 339th, never returned. His plane was never found. He rests somewhere in the jungle that claimed Yamamoto too. Two warriors on opposite sides, joined by history, by fire, and by fate. 1944, 1945, Washington, D.C. Office of Naval Intelligence. Behind a locked door on the third floor of a nondescript stone building near the Potomac River, a group of uniformed officers and civilian analysts sat hunched over rows of filing cabinets, decoding intercepts from the Pacific. These were the men and women of Station Hypo, OP-20G, and other top-secret branches of the Allied code-breaking machine. Few outside this room knew the full truth about Operation Vengeance. Fewer still knew just how thin the line between success and disaster had been. Had Yamamoto's message been delayed by just a few hours? Had the weather turned against the P-38 seconds? Had a single Zero pilot spotted the lightnings minutes earlier? The mission would have failed, and the Americans would have lost their greatest intelligence asset, the fact that they were reading Japan's mail in real time. This was the great paradox of Yamamoto's death. A triumph, yes, but also a risk so severe that every effort had been made to conceal its source. Inside the inner circles of the Navy and White House, the word magic was spoken only in whispers. Magic was the code name for the decrypted Japanese communications produced from JN-25, the Imperial Navy's main cipher system. The Americans had cracked it after years of grueling work, aided by a blend of captured codebooks, mathematical brilliance, and sleepless nights. It was magic that had revealed Yamamoto's itinerary. It was magic that had allowed Mitchell's squadron to launch with precision. And it was magic that would continue feeding the Allies critical insight as they planned operations in the Marianas, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Had the Japanese realized their codes were broken, the entire war might have shifted. That's why, even as press leaks trickled out in late 1943, the Roosevelt administration carefully shaped the narrative. They said the P-38 seconds had lucked into an enemy formation. They said it was a routine patrol. They said nothing of intercepts, broken ciphers, or advanced knowledge. They couldn't afford the truth. But within the Japanese command structure, doubt had already taken root. By mid-1944, Japanese cipher officers had begun reviewing the security of JN-25. New variants were issued, complexities increased, transmission protocols were adjusted. But the damage had been done. Yamamoto's death had not only shocked morale, it had cast a long shadow of paranoia. Orders were now second-guessed, inspections postponed. Field commanders took longer to execute directives, fearing traps. The very foundation of centralized coordination, a cornerstone of Yamamoto's doctrine, was fracturing. It was exactly the kind of instability the Allies needed. Meanwhile, on the front lines of the Pacific, The war had entered a new phase. In the skies above Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, P-38 seconds screamed through the clouds, still performing long-range missions, still pushing deep into Japanese airspace. Though eventually overshadowed by the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in Europe, the Lightning remained the workhorse of the Pacific. In the jungles of New Guinea, the mountains of Burma, and the atolls of the Marshalls, rumors persisted. Rumors of American planes that never run out of fuel, of ghost fighters that fly under the sea. To many Japanese soldiers and airmen, Yamamoto's death wasn't just a loss, it was a message. A message that said, "You are not safe. No rank, no title, no distance will shield you." Back in the United States, the men of the 339th quietly returned to duty or to home. Rex Barber, forever composed, eventually received the Navy Cross. It was a quiet ceremony. No photographers, no ticker tape. Thomas Lanfire, meanwhile, had found his way into the spotlight. He gave interviews, sat on war panels, and was even referenced in wartime propaganda. Though the shared credit had been official, Lanfire often told the story as though he alone had fired the fatal shot. It grated on Barber, not out of ego but because history deserved to be precise. The feud would simmer for decades. In the 1,970 seconds, analysis of after-action reports, flight paths, and the angle of attack suggested that Barber's version was more consistent with the wreckage and witness accounts. In 1991, the Air Force finally amended the official record to reflect this, crediting Barber with the probable kill. Lanfire died the same year. And what of the wreckage? For decades, the site in Bougainville, where Yamamoto's Betty crashed, lay undisturbed. Dense jungle and remote location protected it from the looters and scrap hunters that ravaged other wartime sites. But in 2005, Japanese and local authorities worked together to recover artifacts, fragments of fuselage, scorched instruments, and even the remnants of Yamamoto's katana. A memorial plaque now marks the spot, half hidden in the forest. It bears Yamamoto's name and a quiet epitaph. "A warrior sleeps here, taken not by dishonor, but by the course of war." Pilgrims visit it, some Japanese, some Americans. They bring flowers, they stand in silence. And perhaps they wonder what might have happened had that single message not been intercepted. Had that flight left an hour earlier? Had the Lightnings been 10 minutes late? So much, balanced on so little. That is the legacy of Operation Vengeance. Not just a story of revenge, not merely the downing of one man's plane, but a collision of precision, luck, engineering, intelligence, and history itself. And behind it all, the silhouette of a plane, once mocked for its strange design, now stands immortal. The P-38 Lightning, a fork-tailed devil, a jungle ghost. The aircraft that silenced the voice of Pearl Harbor and changed the course of the Pacific War. June 1943. February 1944. South Pacific Theater. The jungle winds whispered through the palms of Bougainville, but the echo of Admiral Yamamoto's death carried far beyond the island. It drifted from hut to bunker, from destroyer deck to aircraft hangar, from Japanese outposts to Allied planning rooms. It reached generals and sergeants, pilots and prisoners. And with it came a message, unspoken but understood. The Americans could strike anyone, anywhere. The loss of Yamamoto reverberated through the Pacific War in ways no bomb or bullet ever could. It didn't just silence a strategist, it shattered the illusion of control. Japan had prided itself on preparation, discipline, and order. But now, a deep unease was setting in. The enemy, it seemed, had not only found their rhythm, they had found their reach. Japanese morale began to fragment. At sea, sailors murmured of Yamamoto's ghost watching the fleet. On air bases, pilots checked the sky more often, more nervously. Commanders became reluctant to travel. Meetings were shortened, movements delayed. Orders altered at the last minute in fear of hidden eyes. Admiral Minichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, took over with formal authority but none of the same mystique. Where Yamamoto had blended iron will with quiet calculation, Koga was stiffer, more traditional. He emphasized the Bushido spirit, loyalty, and the inevitability of sacrifice. But what he couldn't recreate, was Yamamoto's understanding of the enemy. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, played poker with American officers. He'd walked Wall Street and watched Detroit's factories in motion. He had known that Japan's only chance for victory lay in a short, decisive war. Now that war was dragging into its third year, the decisive blow had become a long bleed, and the Americans were only growing stronger. By late 1943, Operation Cartwheel was underway. The Allies, under General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Bull Halsey, launched coordinated strikes across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Archipelago. Each move drove deeper into territory Yamamoto had once held tightly. Each island captured tightened the noose around Rabaul, once the Imperial Navy's strongest bastion in the South Pacific. Without Yamamoto's guiding hand, Rabaul was left exposed to a new American strategy. Not capture, but isolation. Rather than storm it with infantry, the Allies simply leapfrogged the fortress, cutting it off from supply and reinforcements. Rabaul became a prison for its own garrison, a military relic entombed in jungle and fear. It was a maneuver Yamamoto might have anticipated. His loss had left a vacuum not just of leadership, but of vision. Meanwhile, in the skies, the P-38 Lightning was rewriting air superiority. In the months following Operation Vengeance, Lightnings took part in long-range fighter sweeps over New Guinea, where their twin engines offered the confidence to fly deeper than any other Allied fighter. Deadly ground attack runs on Japanese airfields, strafing parked aircraft, fuel depots, and command tents. Bomber escort missions as far as the Mariana Islands, where Zeros once ruled unchallenged. The P-38's profile, distinctive and fearsome, became a symbol of unstoppable reach. American pilots began painting Yamamoto's name on their noses, alongside victory tallies. Even captured Japanese soldiers, when interrogated, referred to the Lightning with the reverence once reserved for their own Zeros. It was aerial dominance through fear and function. But with dominance came sacrifice. The war was far from over, and the men who flew the Lightnings paid dearly for every mile of progress. For every successful escort mission, another failed recon cost a life. In New Guinea, jungles swallowed wreckage like graveyards. Dozens of P-38 seconds went missing, their crews never found. In the Philippines, heavy flak and sudden squalls grounded the sleek aircraft in mud and ruin. And in China, missions flown from hastily built airstrips ran dangerously low on fuel with every sortie. Yet, through it all, the legacy of the Yamamoto mission drove the 339th and other squadrons forward. They had proven that even the highest echelons of the Japanese war machine were vulnerable, that even the untouchable could be touched, and that precision, not just power, would win this war. In Tokyo, fear became policy. The Imperial Navy drastically curtailed the public release of officer movements. Travel orders were now issued in person. Planes were reassigned at the last minute. Cipher systems were overhauled, though not always successfully. Japan had learned from Yamamoto's death, but the lessons came too late. The Americans had already built a war machine that fed on momentum, and now it was rolling forward with terrifying efficiency. Yamamoto had once predicted, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States, I will run wild. But I have no confidence for the second or third year." He had been right. By mid-1944, Japan was on the defensive everywhere, from the Marianas to the Carolines, from the jungles of Burma to the reefs of Peleliu. And as the noose tightened, every Japanese commander knew that the admiral who might have altered this course was gone. His death, delivered at 10,000 feet over Bougainville, had become more than a mission. It was a turning point. Spring 1945. Central Pacific Command, Tinian Island. The war was entering its terminal phase, but it had not yet loosened its grip. The sun over Tinian beat down on endless rows of freshly built runways and fuel dumps. Rows of massive B-29 superfortresses shimmered in the heat, each one capable of carrying destruction across entire cities. The United States was preparing for the final act, the destruction of Japan's industrial heartland. But amid these new giants of war, the ghost of an old mission still lingered. In the officers' club, carved from Quonset huts and sandbags, veterans of the South Pacific Campaign gathered in tired clusters. Many had begun their tours in Guadalcanal, New Guinea, or Bougainville, the places where Yamamoto's command had once reached with impunity. Now, those same places were rear bases, stepping stones in the American empire of logistics. Among them sat Major Rex Barber, quietly nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. He wore a crisp uniform, clean-shaven, boots polished, but his eyes drifted often out toward the sea or toward the roar of bombers taking off. He had been offered promotions, transfers, stateside teaching jobs. He had declined them all because something had started with Yamamoto, and he intended to see it through. Meanwhile, in Japan, the war had become a matter of survival. The death of Admiral Yamamoto in 1943 had triggered a strategic drift from which the Imperial Navy never truly recovered. His successors had lacked his independence of thought. Many clung to old doctrines. Others, seeking to honor him, doubled down on suicidal strategies. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered his fleet into a chaotic engagement against overwhelming American carrier groups. The result was catastrophic. Japanese battleships and cruisers fell like dominoes beneath waves of torpedo bombers and dive bombers. Yamamoto would never have allowed such recklessness. He had valued lives, not just symbols. He had believed in calculated risk. His successors, by contrast, often substituted faith for foresight. Perhaps the most tragic manifestation of this was the rise of the kamikaze. From the decks of aircraft carriers and coastal airfields, young men now launched into the sky with no intention of returning. The kamikaze was not just a tactic, it was a symptom. A sign that Japan had lost its strategic bearings. It was a policy Yamamoto had fiercely opposed in life. Despite his loyalty to the emperor, he had always resisted turning war into martyrdom. He knew better. He had studied in the West. He understood that steel and fuel, not honor and slogans, determined victory. But now he was gone. And in his place stood men who saw death as currency. The very decapitation strike that had killed him had removed the last firewall between the Japanese Navy and spiritual desperation. And yet, in America, Yamamoto's name had become strangely respected. He was still the enemy, yes, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the mind behind Coral Sea and Midway. But he was also remembered as a formidable opponent, a man of dignity and strategic brilliance. Among pilots, he was spoken of with something close to reverence. It was understood that taking him down hadn't just been a mission, it had been an honor. You didn't cheer over Yamamoto's death. You nodded in grim respect. Some American strategists even began to ask, had they cut down a man they might have negotiated with? One who understood the limits of war? But such thoughts came too late. The machine was in motion now, grinding toward Tokyo. Summer 1945, over the home islands. The P-38 seconds that had once stalked Yamamoto still flew, though fewer now. Replaced by faster, more agile machines like the P-51 Mustang and the B-29 Superfortress, the Lightning had become a veteran of the air, its time near done. But it remained a symbol. The Japanese no longer laughed at it. They feared it. When it appeared, they knew something was about to die. One veteran Zero pilot, captured after the fall of Okinawa, told his interrogators through a translator, "We feared your twin-tailed fighter." It was the sign that death would not wait until tomorrow. August 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war would end not in the skies above Bougainville, or in the engine hum of P-38 seconds, but in two blinding flashes, firestorms that turned cities into shadows. Yet even as mushroom clouds replaced dogfights, even as Japan surrendered, one truth remained unchanged. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death had marked the turning of the tide. From that moment, Japan was no longer on the offensive. From that moment, the initiative had passed to the Allies. And from that moment, every decision made by the Japanese High Command would carry a quiet question behind it. What would Yamamoto have done? Years later, in the post-war halls of military academies, Operation Vengeance would be studied again and again. Not for its kill count, not for its tactics, but for what it revealed: the power of intelligence, the reach of precision warfare, the impact of removing a single man from the chessboard of history. The mission had been born in silence, flown in secrecy, and recorded with controversy. But it had altered the shape of a war, and it had reminded the world that no commander, no matter how respected, feared, or protected, is ever truly out of reach. Not when the lightning comes. The 2nd of September 1945, Tokyo Bay. Gray skies hung low over the still waters of the bay. Aboard the deck of the USS Missouri, American sailors stood at rigid attention as a handful of Japanese delegates walked stiffly toward the table prepared for surrender. General Douglas MacArthur, flanked by Admirals Nimitz, Halsey, and other Allied commanders, awaited them. The war in the Pacific, 6 years of fire, jungle, steel, and silence, was ending. As the Japanese officers bowed and laid down their swords, somewhere in the minds of those present echoed the names of the fallen. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Bougainville. And for those who knew, for those who had studied the war not just as combat but as chess, the name Yamamoto hung in the air like a specter. He had not lived to see his homeland brought to its knees, but his absence had shaped the path that led to this very deck. Elsewhere, at an Army airfield in Okinawa, a row of worn-out P-38 Lightnings sat under canvas tarps, their missions finished. Some bore faded nose art lightning bolts, sharks, and names of sweethearts. Others bore kill tallies, fading in the Sunday. One still had the words, "For Hine," stenciled beneath the canopy in hand-painted block letters. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, lost over Bougainville during the Yamamoto raid, had never been found. But among the men of the 339th, he had never been forgotten. When the news of Japan's surrender broke, those who had flown with him toasted his name in mess tents, from Manila to Guam. Quietly. No cheers, no fireworks, just memory. The P-38, too, had reached the end of its war. From the skies of France to the jungles of Burma, the twin-boomed Lightning had earned its place in aviation history. It had intercepted bombers, escorted raids, strafed convoys, and hunted high-value targets. But it would always be most remembered for one flight, one mission, one singular shot that rewrote the course of an empire. Operation Vengeance. Even now, military scholars debate its legality, its ethics, its consequences. Was it an assassination or a legitimate act of war? Did it hasten the end or merely sharpen the blade? But for those who planned it, flew it, and survived it, the mission had been a necessity, a message, a turning point. In post-war Japan, Yamamoto's legacy underwent a transformation. No longer simply the man who bombed Pearl Harbor, he was remembered by many Japanese as the last strategist who understood the nature of modern war. In a country where the post-war generation would eventually turn against the militarism of the 1930 seconds, Yamamoto came to symbolize not expansionism, but tragic foresight. He had warned them, should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines. We would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians have that confidence. He had known that America could not be bullied. That war with such a nation could only end one way. Perhaps that's why, even in death, Yamamoto was never demonized by the Americans. He was their enemy, but never their monster. Decades later, in the forests of Bougainville, a new generation of scholars and locals rediscovered the crash site. Amid rusted metal and jungle roots, fragments of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty were recovered. Alongside it, broken instruments, scorched uniform buttons, a rusted ceremonial sword. The site was cleaned, cleared, and marked with a simple memorial, a granite slab with bilingual text. Asterisk. Here fell Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the 18th of April, 1943. May the lessons of war yield peace. Asterisk. Each year, American and Japanese visitors alike leave flowers there. Some bow, others salute. Most simply stand in silence. The rainforest pressing in around them. The wind whispering through the trees as if still carrying the distant hum of Allison engines. And what of the men who flew the mission? Major John Mitchell, the mission commander, retired with honors. He never sought the limelight, preferring the respect of his peers to the glow of headlines. Captain Rex Barber lived a quiet life in Oregon. He served in the Air Force until 1961, then worked in forestry and public service. For decades, he refused to publicly criticize Thomas Lanphier, despite the controversy over the kill credit. But he also never changed his version of events. He didn't need to. In 1991, after exhaustive research, the U.S. Air Force amended the official record, awarding Barber sole credit for shooting down Yamamoto. Lanphier, who had passed away that same year, never saw the correction. Barber, in his final interviews, spoke not of glory, but of duty. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about the kill. It was about stopping the war, stopping more killing. That's what we all wanted. He died in 2001, at the age of 84. And the Lightning? Many were scrapped. A few ended up in museums. One was restored and painted to match the markings flown during Operation Vengeance. It hangs today in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, suspended mid-dive. Engines roaring in frozen time. Visitors walk beneath it, reading the placard. Most pass on, some linger. And a few, the ones who understand what it took, what it cost to change the direction of a war, look up and whisper. They laughed at the P-38. But then they watched Yamamoto die.